Hello, and welcome to Religion and Life. I'm your host, Ozzie Oswalt. One of the most important archaeological discoveries of the 20th century was the uncovering of a collection of ancient manuscripts in 1945. These texts, known as the Nag Hammadi Library, forever enlightened us and redefined the way we understand early Christianity. My guest today, Professor Elaine Pagels, was at the forefront of scholarship on the Nag Hammadi Library and continues to be recognized as an expert on these texts and on early Christianity. Welcome, Dr. Pagels. May I call you Elaine?
Please do. Good to see you, Ozzie.
Thank you so much for joining us today. You have been at Princeton University for quite some time now and serve as the Harrington Spear Payne Foundation Professor of Religion. And you're still teaching classes on Christianity and the Gnostic text. And I'll just tell you that your work, in particular, the books, the Gnostic Gospels and Adam, Eve, and the Serpent, really helped me, and I know a whole generation of scholars and lay people understand early Christianity in a different light. So we are indebted to your contributions to scholarship and to the study of religion. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I mean, that discovery certainly changed the way I understood any of this. So it was as much a surprise to me as it might be to anyone else.
Well, it did. It was one of those moments in academic scholarship that really did change things. And your work was pioneering in so many ways. And I know I want to talk about your latest book, Why Religion, but I want to talk just a little bit about some of that early work. You write in Why Religion that not everybody was happy to read what you were writing early on, that there was some pushback to these discoveries. Could you describe that a little bit?
Well, yeah, maybe we should talk a little more about what they are. I mean, I went to graduate school to try to find out, what do we know about Jesus? How did the Christianity start? How much do we know about that? And I found out that the earliest New Testament accounts, the Gospel of Mark, say, is written 40 years after the death of Jesus, and the others are written 50 or 60 years after the death of Jesus. I mean, that's quite a long time. And I thought it was as much as we could find out. But then my professors, to my total surprise, were exploring a whole group of secret gospels, which I'd never heard about, called the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Philip and the Gospel of Peter and the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. I didn't know there were any others besides the ones in the New Testament. None of us did, or most of us didn't.
Right.
And we started to realize that what we know about Christian tradition and how it started is really kind of a narrow stream compared with a whole wider range of sources that there were in the ancient world, which sort of add other dimensions to the story about Jesus and his teaching and the life of his disciples. So that changed a great deal. And some people were shocked and said, this is terrible, awful stuff, and you should never write about it. And I said, well, I didn't invent it. I just happened to work on it and find it very interesting that there's a lot more we didn't know.
Yeah. Well, I think anytime you make discoveries or have a thesis that challenges the orthodoxy, and in this case, I'm talking about the intellectual orthodoxy, not the theological orthodoxy. I think academics take it to be a real challenge and a threat because it threatens to upset what we think we've known all this time. And I think academics tend to be a kind of conservative lot in instances like that.
Well, it does happen that way.
Yeah.
Especially if you're finding things that that are surprising.
Right. Now you were a pioneer in another way. I was reading Why Religion, and I found it jarring to hear your description about the resistance you received when you wanted to go to graduate school to enter religious studies,
Yes.
Both from the graduate committee and even your father. So in some ways, I think you were a pioneer for women in the academy. Could you mention that and talk about that just a little bit?
Well, when I applied to graduate school, I was coming out of college, which was a coeducational college. So I thought, I didn't think much about it. But when I applied to graduate school at Harvard, I got a letter from the dean who said, well, ordinarily we'd admit a student with your qualifications. However, when we've admitted women, which we've hardly ever done, they always quit. So we really can't give a place in our graduate school to a woman. It just doesn't work out. And I was really taken aback. But that was the case. I mean, there were very few women in graduate school at the time, and very few allowed, and very few at the. I then later they did accept me to come, and my roommate was one of 7 women in the entire Harvard Law School. There were maybe 300 in the class. There were very few women in the medical school, the Harvard Law School, the business school, any of it. That's changed a lot, but it was certainly a different world then.
Yeah, I think it has changed a lot. I think women are still underrepresented in religious studies for the most part, but I'm so happy that you stuck with it and they didn't deny us one of the most important scholars in religious studies due to their short-sightedness. So
well, thank
you didn't give up. So let's talk about your book, Why Religion? This is a departure from your normal academic and scholarly writing. It's a memoir. And I was intrigued, first of all, by the title. And I think you raised that question, why religion, in different contexts throughout the book, and give different answers. Could you speak to that just a little bit?
Well, I didn't expect to write a memoir, just as you say. And I did it because there were some things I wanted to or needed to write about personally, but also because people would say to me, why religion? Why do you do that? I mean, many people I know, say here in Princeton and New Jersey, in the university particularly, have little contact with any religious institution. So they just thought it was weird. And I love the study of religion. I discovered when I was 14 the power of it when I went to a Billy Graham crusade and got born again. It was a very powerful experience, and I wasn't expecting that. My parents were quite horrified because they had really no place for that kind of experience. And I was brought up in a family that was sort of nominally Christian, but they basically thought religion was for people who didn't understand science, who weren't educated. They don't understand the role of religious traditions in our culture, in our traditions, and in the culture and emotional and spiritual lives of every culture there is.
Right. Yeah, and the role of religion that you just mentioned, in your book, you write something like religion and poetry and music and dance and myth. All of these things function to help us, I think your words were, feel with life, to understand or put words to the experiences we have that we might not be able to articulate any other way. That's a very kind of spiritual way of looking at life, I think.
Well, it is, and because you're a professor of religion, that most people, if you say that to somebody you don't know, they'll say, oh, well, do you believe in God? Do you believe in Jesus? So they'll think religion is a matter of a set of beliefs. That's, of course, taken from predominance of Christianity in the contemporary world, because religion became defined as a set of beliefs in the 4th century. Before that, it was called the way. It was a way to live. It was a set of values. It was a set of practices. It was involved with prayer and devotion and service and other kinds of issues. And so many religious traditions are really much more about practice and the values that matter. And they're also very deeply about human emotion and the way we find meaning in our lives. That's really the heart of it, I think.
So when Christianity came ultimately to be defined in the 4th century, as you say, and I guess this is during the rule of Constantine and the Council of Nicaea and so forth. That's a changing moment, a defining moment. Is this when church leaders began to get concerned about some of these earlier texts that you were working with? Because they ultimately got suppressed as being not part of the acceptable Orthodox tradition. Is that correct?
Yes, it was really the founding of an organized Catholic Church as we came to know it. With Constantine, when he became emperor, first Roman emperor to be converted to this religion, which was previously illegal. So after that happened, it became part of a state religion and patronized by the Roman Empire and the emperor. He gave great sums of money to the church and had built beautiful churches. But also he had to figure out what are the right writings for Christians to read. So he asked a bishop, Bishop Eusebius, get me the scriptures, right? Well, okay, they knew what the Hebrew Bible scriptures were, the Jewish texts that were regarded as scriptures, but there wasn't yet a New Testament, a collection of Christian writings that were considered the right ones. There were a lot more writings that Christians read than the ones now in the New Testament. And so they had to decide which were the acceptable, or not even acceptable, but which writings should be read in church. And the ones to be read in church are the ones we now have, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that tell the public teaching of Jesus, what he taught publicly. What they didn't want were gospels that claimed to tell Jesus' secret teaching or other aspects of his teaching, which were sometimes more mysterious and considered to be things that advanced level students needed to know, but not people just walking into a church service.
Yeah. And I take it that Christianity in those early days was a much more kind of dynamic and evolving tradition than after the point when the canon was established and the books were established and others were suppressed. Is that a fair assessment of the early church and the early period of church development?
Well, it certainly, as you suggest, it was a lot more diverse in terms of the way people understood Jesus and his message. So the church established the creed, which said this is the way you need to think about God, about Jesus, about the role of Jesus, and so forth, and about the way of salvation. So they eliminated a lot of sources that added many other aspects to this. But they didn't stop the transformation of the tradition. I mean, even today, many Christians, whether they're Protestants, whether they're Baptists or Lutherans or Catholics or Russian Orthodox or Christian Scientists, they say, well, basically, we're teaching just what Jesus taught.
Right. Yeah.
But they actually choose rather different things about Jesus's teaching to emphasize those really large range of traditions. And so I do realize that, when you study the history of it, that these traditions have never been static. They're revised and reinterpreted in every generation, I think. Every generation who loves these traditions chooses to emphasize different parts of them.
I was taken by something that I think you implied in the latter couple of chapters of your book. And even though you were working on these Gnostic texts from a scholarly perspective, at one point, I think you kind of implied that, I believe it was the Gospel of Thomas, spoke to you or resonated with you in a way that traditional Gospels had not, in a way that helped you really spiritually as well as from a scholarly perspective. So forgive me if I'm reading too much into that, but is that an accurate assessment of your reading of the Gospel of Thomas?
Well, you're absolutely right about that. I mean, it's not that the others hadn't powerfully affected me, because it was the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of John that I had read before, and they were very compelling. But now the Gospel of Thomas added something different. This is a book. It's not even a book, it's just 17 pages of sayings. And it says, these are the secret sayings that Jesus told his disciples when they were together in private. And it claims to be written by one of his close disciples, who's also mentioned in the Gospel of John, the Gospel of Thomas, the disciple Thomas. So I was reading this text, and one of the sayings was, Jesus said, if you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. And I thought, wow, you don't have to believe that. It just happens to be true. It felt true to me.
Yeah.
And so I started to read these with a great deal of interest. It's not that you would take the Gospel of Thomas and throw out the others, but these are meant to be supplemental, right?
Right.
The public teaching of Jesus and the secret teaching of Jesus were different aspects of the teaching. Because in the New Testament, we have, just a few short books that talk about the life of an extraordinarily powerful and charismatic person.
Right.
And certainly, as even the Gospel of John says, if everything that Jesus did were written in this book, the world couldn't contain all of the books. Well, that may be an exaggeration, but nevertheless, it does say there's a lot we don't know.
Right. Do you think these texts will ever be accepted, maybe not universally, but by a large portion of the religious community as supplemental, as you said, to Scripture, or will they just remain kind of a scholarly curiosity?
Well, they're more than a curiosity. They're a subject of intense argument and hot debate.
Yeah.
Some people say these are trash, just ignore these. These were considered heresy by some of the bishops. The bishop said, just get rid of those. We don't read those. You're not supposed to read those. In fact, you're not even allowed to read those because they're not orthodox. And other people find them very illuminating, that they really cast different light and understanding on what we already know. And I happen to be there in that situation. And many people and many Christians would agree with that. And many who aren't also find this text very compelling. So there's a lot of argument. I mean, there's theologians today who say it has nothing to do with the real Jesus.
Right.
And many of us think it might.
Well, I hope you keep advocating for kind of widespread supplemental use. I think there's much wisdom in these texts for all of us. In your book, let's shift gears just a little bit. In your book, Why Religion, you spend a large part of that book talking about the grief that you experienced over the untimely deaths of your young son, Mark, and then your husband, Heinz, a little over a year after that. So really the book is about love and loss and grief. And I think how religion can help us cope and confront with these aspects of living. Again, forgive me if I'm off base, but I read this book almost as a love letter, and dealing, because part of loving is opening oneself up to this existential suffering. Could you comment a little bit on those aspects of the book, and how religion helps us to cope with the suffering of life?
Yes, I mean, there are many strands, that got woven into it. I called it Why Religion, and some people say, yes, but you don't answer that question. And I would say, well, that's actually a question I keep asking myself. That's why I do this work. That's why I'm fascinated to ask the question, how does religion participate in our lives? What does it contribute? What's going on there? So that's one of the questions. But also, as you suggested before, when I wrote about the Gospel of Thomas, I said, I was working on this text, and these texts work on me. And the same is true of other texts in Christian tradition and other traditions. So I was also writing about my personal life and how certain issues, you mentioned the book Adam, Eve, and the Serpent, which is about sex and politics in early Christianity. And I was asking myself, how did the Christian movement come up with the sexual attitudes that it did. And it was asking this at the time when those attitudes in our culture were rapidly changing, as they have been in the last, say, 10 years, 30 years, 50 years, you can name the period. But at the same time, I was also reflecting on these personal losses, which were overwhelming. Our son died at the age of 6.5 of just an incurable lung disease, though he had a wonderful life before that. And then my wonderful husband, who we've been married for 22 years, died in a hiking accident right after we had adopted 2 children, because we couldn't bear the loss of our son without taking care of children. So it was devastating. And I didn't want to write just about grief, because, everybody has grief. Everybody knows about grief. Some people know a lot, and some people know more than I do about it. But anyway, I wanted to write, this is 25 years after those things happened. Before that, I couldn't have written anything like that.
Right.
25 years later, I was thinking, isn't it amazing to live through things you think you can't live through? You think you wouldn't want to live through, and then still have a joyful and creative life with friends and people you love and the children we adopted and so forth. So that seems to me amazing and kind of wonderful. So I wanted to write about resilience. I wanted to write about the surprise that we can get through things we think we can't imagine getting through, and that some of these traditions can be helpful in that kind of process.
Yeah, I know. As you were reflecting at one point in the book on suffering, you drew a comparison between the Jewish and Christian attitudes towards suffering and the Buddhist attitude towards suffering. Namely, that I guess in the Christian tradition, Christianity tends to see suffering as something that comes along as a result of bad deeds or failure. We shouldn't have to suffer, but it's a result of sin. Whereas in the Buddhist tradition, suffering is part of life and accepted as such. And I take it that you found more solace in the latter than in the former.
Well, to some extent. I mean, I felt that some of the things that people suffer from when they're grieving come out of our culture, which can make the grief more painful than it needs to be. Not that it isn't ever painful, it's painful. But the idea that, when somebody gets a terrible diagnosis or suddenly has a disastrous accident, people say, why him? Why did that happen to him? Why me? Why did I? As though there were an answer to that, like you did something.
Yeah.
Now, there are things you can do to bring on disaster. I mean, you can destroy your body in certain ways that create the possibility of illness, make it much more likely. But many times that's not the case. And as you say, when I looked at the Christian tradition, Jewish tradition, it says we wouldn't even die if somebody hadn't sinned. Right? Mm-hmm. But the worst case where this comes out, Ozzie, is where when parents have to deal with the death of a child, a son or a daughter, it's very hard to deal with. And even in the Bible, they're taught that this is because you did something wrong. I mean, I certainly felt like a very unworthy mother, because how could you? Your job is to keep your child alive. And if you can't do that just because it's a completely untreatable and rare illness, but if you can't keep your child alive, you feel like you failed. And so I realized that that's part of what's taught actually in the Bible. When David and Bathsheba, the woman whose husband he had killed so he could take the wife, they had a son, and before they were married, and the infant died, and the Bible says, and the Lord smote the baby, killed the baby effectively because of the sin of the parents. So anyone who has a child die, and of course in the ancient world it could be 40% or 50% of families would see the death of a child at childbirth or soon afterwards, and take it as their own fault, when in fact we know it has to do with all kinds of factors of illness that are difficult to deal with, particularly without the kind of medical treatment we have today. So I wanted to write to other parents as well, because there are many parents who've experienced that and they never talk about it.
Right.
Even to their own children.
Yeah, and that's a lovely message. And I think, even though, as you've suggested, that from a rational perspective, you don't accept those biblical teachings that blame innocent people, but it's part of our cultural matrix, right? I mean, we have to find a way to get beyond those things that we've been taught in order to move on.
When I study religion, I'm interested how this looks to you too. I see that there are great benefits from these traditions, the way they help us understand meaning in situations where otherwise we may not find it. There are ways that religious traditions help us deal with transitions like birth and marriage and adolescence and death, and with the rituals that we have. But there are also liabilities there. There are teachings in there that can be damaging in some situations. And for example, in the Genesis story, which says that the Lord gives Adam dominion over the world to subdue it and keep it. There are many ways which humans do cultivate and dominate the earth and take advantage of its, say, capacities to bring forth food and so forth. But that can also lead to a way of claiming that we have a right to dominate and destroy the environment. I mean, there are Native American tribes like the Mohawk tribes say that story has led to the destruction of our planet, or that kind of thinking about nature not as our mother, but as our property, as our, that we can do anything with. So I'm just saying, I think when studying these stories, it's important to be alert to ways that they contribute to our well-being and ways that they can detract from it.
Absolutely. And you could have taught my class from this past week. It sounds like a discussion we had just this week in one of my classes. Well, unfortunately,
what was that?
Well, the class was the capstone in our Department of Religion, and we were talking about ritual in particular, and how rituals help people within the community navigate the transitions of life, and particularly rites of passage. This has been a lovely conversation. Unbelievably, we're out of time. I feel like I could talk to you all day. I would like to mention that your book really ends on an uplifting note, that the resilience you say you found through relationships and through love, and you describe that as an act of grace. And I appreciate that message, and I hope you continue writing about these things and about the ancient world. And I certainly appreciate you coming on our show today.
Well, thank you. I'm very happy to have this conversation. I've really been enjoying it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And that's it for Religion and Life for this week. I hope you'll join us again on AppTV next week. My guest will be Brian Rainey, and he will talk about the social construction of racial attitudes and ethnic attitudes in the Hebrew Bible. Until then, this is Ozzie Oswalt. Thank you.